online.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, apparently. Sure. Anyway, that's basically my answer. I view it as part of the collaboration.
Mm-hmm. I love that. A collaboration, and the critic is there to make a connection among readers. Jane, what about you? Can you talk about your role as a critic and the questions you raise in your work?
Yeah, I really liked Maria's framework of putting the critic on the side of the reader. And I think that, not to play devil's advocate, but I also think of it as more of a collaboration. But I often find that what I'm trying to do, and I mostly write book reviews, I mostly write reviews or criticism of fiction and nonfiction. I don't really work in poetry, that's a memoir, at least not usually. But I often find that I'm trying to sort of at a baseline level, like I'm writing a book review, I'm trying to translate or deliver or convey what my interpretation of what the author's best thoughts or best insights are. So I think I'm often not necessarily advocating for the author alone, but I think I'm trying to, I think only in my life have I written like truly maybe like a handful of negative or what could be interpreted even as negative reviews. I don't really, generally, if I think I'm not going to like a text, or if I find that I don't like a text, I won't go out it. I won't review it. So I'm often trying to facilitate and be a generous, I don't know, yeah, a kind of generous mediator or mouthpiece for the author, or even kind of projecting what I think would be like the best version of what the author is trying to do. So I think I'm often trying to sort of, I'm starting with the text or the writer itself and trying to kind of dilate out.
Yeah.
I go right after people with a knife if they offend me. I really do. I wrote the absolute most scathing piece about Joan Didion. I got in so much trouble for that because people love Joan Didion, but it just drove me wild. Her politics drove me freaking wild. So I wrote this absolute screed about, it's sort of like, okay, here's a counterpoint for you. You could disagree with this if you want. I'm not trying to tell anybody like think like I do, but it's kind of like not everybody loves this lady. It's Ixnay on the Idian day, but yeah. So say more about that, Jane. Why not go after people when they drive you crazy?
Oh, I mean, I think, like probably the simple answer is that like I don't have the stomach for it. I feel like my version of that is like I wrote a review of Kat Marnell's blog post way back when for the I'm not going to tell you where. I don't want anyone to read it. But
yeah, that was a hot topic at one time.
Yeah, it was. I mean, yeah, like the topic itself dates the piece, and I was sort of like pro Kat Marnell, and I remember anyway the like 5-hour cycle in which I felt like people were mad at me. It was even like this person's even someone who likes this person's writing, their interpretation is.
Yeah, that was a particularly napalm topic for a bit there.
Yeah, so I learned the hard way. But I mean, I think, yeah, I think of criticism really like as a public service. I think, I'm also, a lot of the things that I review are academic adjacent, if not actual, works of literary criticism or scholarship by academics that are kind of straddling, trade markets, but also academic ones. So I think I'm often trying to, make maybe the academic monograph more legible. I want the reader, I'm also on the side of the reader insofar as I want them to pick up the book or look at a book that maybe they otherwise would not think it's for them. So
I think
it's,
Jane, oh, go ahead, Maria.
I was just going to say there's not much time in a person's life to read books. I remember like there was this really bizarre assertion that Susan Sontag made at some point, that she had a library of 15,000 books, that she had read them over and over, her own library. And so I wrote this piece for the New Yorker, like, I forget why. I was like, I'm writing this thing. And I was like, I don't know about that. And so like I started doing the math. And in order to read 15,000 books even once, starting from the age of 3, you'd have like 2 days per book or something like that, including like Crime and Punishment. It's not possible. I mean, we have this very limited amount of time and we forget. And so like I honor the idea that we should be steering people to think things that we think are of value, just to honor the fact that there's all this to read. You go in the library and it's overwhelming. You can't. So it's a valid approach.
Yeah, I think on that note, Maria, too, I think that dissuades a lot of people from lending their voice into discourse because they feel like they're not well read enough. They can't go toe to toe with certain people who have read 15,000, whatever number of books. And so how do you make criticism more egalitarian, right? Or even open it up to different types of canons, how people have been exposed to different types of literature, different types of cultural media, right? So that's definitely a question I want to come back to near the end. But Jane, I want to come back to what you were saying about, you don't really write negative reviews, but at the same time, through the academic lens, you do kind of dissect certain pieces of work. And, I had mentioned to you earlier about your piece on the Queen's Gambit. And, in that piece, you critique how the audience consumes period pieces and the convenient elision of history and pop culture. And I love that because there's a quote in there. I'll quote back to you. It says, quote, "We're not only getting worse at reading history, but also failing to understand our own present moment." And I guess my question to you with that is, as you mentioned that you're on the side of the reader, how do you make such connections, these academic connections, and make them available to the average viewer, reader, consumer?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's helpful that that I study the contemporary. But I'm trained, I mean, I work on sort of late 20th, early 21st century literature and film and media. So I think it's helpful that already in my academic work, I'm trying to make certain texts that are not yet even valid for academic audiences. So there's a kind of movement in both ways. So I enjoy sort of that flexibility, that sort of the flexibility required to move sort of across historical registers, but also maybe like what we might say are canonized older texts that have been vetted by scholars and readers and critics, and also newer ones that might, like with the Queen's Gambit, might be somewhat viral, Netflix series, whatever, could be seen as like aesthetically valid for some reasons, but might not actually hold up to the test of time. So I think a lot of it is just trying to help, let's say, like general readers or non-scholars understand that the things that they're consuming all have like traditions, right? Or they're actually rooted or troping on or borrowing from the canon. So I think that, once you connect through like a genre or trope or a character type, right? Something that they're consuming in the present that actually has had many like sort of afterlives and prehistories. I think that's often, that's at least how I do it with students. So I think that's also how I often try to do it with with my writing, because with students too, right? I mean, I sort of, when I'm writing criticism, I think, many of the time trying to write for like a really smart undergrad. So it's not actually that different from, a big part of what I think of as sort of what I do sort of pedagogically. It's like you actually have a purchase, on literary canon making, literary tradition, and the way that those historical tropes get deployed in the present actually both tells us something about what we value about the past, but also might actually tell us, like, it might actually be a kind of a weather vane of things that are changing in the present. So just historically, I guess trying to sort of convey that we're actually all part of an aesthetic tradition, even if at different moments people are taking up the objects in different ways.
From that vantage, and this question to the both of you, in your work, Maria, as a journalist, Jane, in your academic work, your criticism, as you try to make those connections to your audience, what does that speak to you about the state of literature today? Or even the state of critical thought, and what people are connecting with, what have you seen from your professional vantage points?
We're under attack. Serious people and writers and people who care about sort of cultural posterity are under attack on many fronts. We have political enemies. We have like this AI problem. We've got like, the sort of stuff that I'm older than you guys, like, sort of grew up taking for granted, that like it was just never going to change. The academy seems so solid, like who would ever go after a library or ban a book again? That would never happen, right? Never. But so I kind of view the state of literature now as a battlefield for freedom of expression and speech rights, press freedom, everything that I would assume, I think I would make it bet a lot of money that pretty much everybody here has values that are deeply involved with the freedom to read whatever you want and think whatever you want, and I think that literature is intimately involved in that freedom and provides, even in the most sort of autocratic states, a lifeline, because even like, in the Stalinist period, like people were writing really good novels, maybe they couldn't publish them, you didn't see The Master and Margarita until a bit later, but it's a way of keeping thought alive. And so I kind of think we're living in a very critical time, and we should all be proud to be in this fight.
Yeah, I want to echo everything that Maria said. I often feel kind of, at least from my vantage point, I often feel anxious that, at least both the readerly landscape and the critical landscape are kind of being homogenized. I often feel guilty that the things that I review or the things that I'm asked to review, not all the time, but oftentimes, you're trying to review because I'm not writing fiction, let's say, and I'm not doing, I rarely do, sort of actual reporting. I might do reporting insofar as I will interview other scholars, on a topic, but I'm not sort of like on the street. I've done that a few times, but it's not really my forte. So I often feel a little guilty that, I think this is also why I try to advocate for things that people might not otherwise read. Like I'm often worried that, what the New Yorker sort of fiction section publishes in their review is actually not actually representative of both the present, but also what, it's a kind of sliver. It's like a kind of middle/high brow populist sliver of what people are reading. So I'm just constantly, because I work on the contemporary, I'm constantly worried about how criticism is sort of preemptively shaping, what people consume and what is going to be read in the future. So, but yeah, it's a kind of, as a critic, it's a hard push and pull, because you want to advocate for things that people might not otherwise read. You also want people to read and care about what you write about, but it often becomes this, I'm getting in the weeds, but it becomes a kind of feedback loop. Like what text do you choose to write on or think about or present to the public is in and of itself, a kind of class political statement. So I take that, the sort of maybe the ethics of that kind of seriously. Just even like object selection.
Yeah.
It's not just one's take, but like what does one decide to orient oneself around in a piece?
Did you guys read much McLuhan?
Oh, a little. I mean, I feel like I did. I did an undergrad more, I think. Yeah.
I think he is increasingly like I consider him sort of the father of modern criticism, or at least my approach of it, where like he was really omnivorous. And that kind of speaks to like what Jane was just saying about like having a sort of broad view. I guess I think the New Yorker does a pretty good job insofar as they've got like the TV stuff going, and they talk about movies and, popular TV shows. They did a good job on Succession, I thought. But like, for the most part, we still have a somewhat of a concept of highbrow. But I think probably the big change that's happened in my lifetime, again, because I'm older, but like my husband, like when he went to Oxford, it was sort of like, to study English meant that you sort of stop at some crazy like Milton, you know what I mean? Like it was, or Shakespeare, that would be the end, right? Like that's like as modern as they would go. Like, and that was a big thing that McLuhan was responsible for, was changing like what people were going to study, I guess, in Canada to start with, right? Like we're going to study modern stuff. We're going to study, at least we're going to study the 18th and 19th centuries. We're going to study novels. We're going to, it's the, to expand the idea of like what serious scholars of literature would be their sort of natural purview. And then separately from that, what technology is doing to our view of culture, like, how we experience culture based on the actual media of it. I think like those two things are just explosively, he was just proved right in the most craziest way that he could never have imagined, I would think. Like, I read the Gutenberg Galaxy, like, I don't know, a few years back. There was some centenary, I was supposed to write something about it. I was like, wow, I hadn't read that. I had read some other stuff, but it's like, I highly recommend it to everybody. The Gutenberg Galaxy. If you're interested in criticism and you read this thing, it is monumentally interesting.
Maria, talk more on that point, and it's interesting hearing the both of you talk about, again, going back to drawing connections. You think about centuries past where a lot of critics assume that the audience has read this canon, right? They can make references to, Proust or, Virginia Woolf, and it was just sort of a given. Today, now you have this confluence of media. So we're flooded with content, Jane, you mentioned that, your goal was to link people back to those narratives, so to speak, those historical narratives. But it seems like today we're just sort of awash in just the now. I guess I'll start with Maria. When you mention technology, it's sort of overwhelming, especially with AI and stuff. But you are somebody who really embraces technology and art and the convergences of them both. Could you speak more to your mission and how you see those intersect?
Yeah. I first started writing about Bitcoin in 2013 when Matt Buchanan, actually, who I think edited you too, Jane, when he was at the All, he went to the New Yorker and he had this blog that was about technology. It was called Elements. And he's like, you want to write something? I was so excited. And I'm like, yeah. He's like, what do you want to write about? I'm like, Bitcoin. And he's like, what? I'm like, it's going to be a thing. He's like, oh, okay, go ahead. And so I wrote about it. People thought it was really weird. And then it did turn into a thing. And then it turned into a monster. It's like, I think this has happened over and over with anybody who's kind of grown up with the internet, as I imagine most people here have. It's like the simultaneous sort of leapfrogging of the benefits and the sort of demerits of it kind of just keep coming. It's kind of like, it's like, ooh, this good thing. Oh, we're going to ruin it. Ooh, this good thing. Ooh, we're going to ruin that too. And it's kind of like, it just keeps happening. So in terms of like sort of cultural production, what I think is I've written a little bit about this at the Nation. This AI thing I consider to be a horror show, and wrote right away about how it was full of lies, and it's like already messing up Google, which was already a mess, and now it's like a volcano and torrent of garbage that is spewing all over. It's like, this thing's got to be, can somebody, hello, you know? So I wrote this whole thing, but blockchain technology, which is what powers Bitcoin, and there's other ways of dealing with this. Simultaneously with those advances in technology, you have like blockchain technology, which is capable of verifying, authenticating texts. If somebody wants to do it, it's conceivable to create, you know, all kinds of applications that you can register stuff that and say, I wrote this, and have a private key, and people can know that it's you, and it is 100% rock solid. It is just like, it's like us talking right now. Could somebody make a deep fake of me saying all this nonsense? Yeah, absolutely. Like, would they? Unlikely. You know what I mean? It's like the technology is too, when it gets too hard, then, you know, you won't bother. And so that is a very important thing that's happening right now. There are technological safeguards that we can make use of to push back against the bad things that technology is doing to culture. And then the other thing that's happening is that people like Jane and you, Michael, and Scott, and everybody who works in universities are now doing much more important work suddenly this year than it was 5 years ago, because y'all are able to authenticate texts and able to authenticate like original ideas that are human derived. And it's actually not that hard for people who are trained professionally. Like the people who you find saying that, like, you know, ChatGPT writes actual English are not English professors. Or anybody who writes anything, right? It's like some tech bro is like going to be satisfied with this thing that's written like a Blender instruction manual, but like, you know, people who actually know writing, they won't. And so I think it's going to be more and more important and more necessary, more and more valuable to have experts who can identify and authenticate and share the actual meanings of text. That paradoxically, it creates a huge premium on understanding texts, which is a great thing, potentially. I mean, there's this potentially fantastic elements of what is happening right now that can be seized and exploited on behalf of you know, the forces of good.
Mm-hmm. Jane, what about you? What's your rebuttal, your response to that?
Oh man, I mean, I taught a little. I mean, this past year I was teaching at Cal Arts, so it's actually a little. I kind of was able to circumvent some of the chat GPT AI. I mean, I guess anxiety, just because the kinds of assignments that I was asking my students to write were not, I don't know, the more programmatic 3 5 paragraph essay. So it would not have actually been very useful for them to research. So anyway, so I haven't really been in the classroom. I've definitely, you know, at least just sort of anecdotally on Twitter seen English professors, at least the people that I engage with, confronting some of this stuff. So I'm not entirely sure, right, what it's going to look like. And I think Ted Chang wrote this great piece about I think ChatGPT for the New Yorker, where I mean, the thing that makes me anxious is that all of the models are trained on prior texts, right? So the idea that one could that certain like voices and trains of thoughts, right, kind of get encoded in like the final product is kind of is nerve-wracking for me. One thing that I've been curious about, and I think I'll probably try to do it down the line, is maybe try to along the lines of what Maria was saying, like try to harness some of that technology in teaching. Like I had a really great, wise, sort of older emeritus professor. I mean, she's retired, but she was sort of saying, oh, what I would do is I would have, you know, in the classroom, have ChatGPT like throw up some essays and then have the students sort sort of, kind of edit or deconstruct them, like what's actually, because I think the thing with a lot of students that I get in the classroom is that like they actually, this thing that's like purportedly really easy for ChatGPT to do, that they struggle with. Like, they actually don't know what's supposed to be in a intro paragraph. I think it would be kind of nice to be like, what actually is ChatGPT doing well here? And kind of reverse. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm kind of curious about like, and then again, like what is it potentially not capturing, or what are its tells that it's, I don't know, a bot produced argument.
Yeah.
Well, the first time I actually really engaged with it was sort of by accident. Like Matthew Ingram had noticed that there's this libertarian economics professor named Tyler Cowen. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's kind of out there on Twitter and whatnot, which I've stopped using. Sadly, I used to love it, but I just cannot do it. I'm trying Blue Sky, and I really like Mastodon, but Mastodon takes a lot of work, and I think people they don't have an easy in yet for it. But anyway, that's an aside. So Matthew Ingram, my colleague at the Columbia Journalism Review, where I write sometimes, had noticed that Tyler Cowen, this economics professor, had published a story about Francis Bacon as the chief critic of the printing press in the 17th century. And I was like, what? So it turned out that Tyler Cowen had like published all these fake quotes, because, ChatGPT makes stuff up. And so I was just so amazed by this, because the quotes in the piece were so un-Francis Bacon. It just was really, because I used to really love that when I was a kid, right? The essays or counsels or whatever. So anyway, I'm like, no, that's not true. But anyway, so he had noticed that like it had probably made some stuff up, and then I went and looked into it, and then I wrote to Tyler Cowen. I wrote to my editors at The Nation or something. I said, like, I didn't write about this because this is crazy. This guy's like published this fake stuff, and he said his own byline saying like, look what Francis Bacon said about the printing press. It's like, no, he didn't. Oh my God, you're a professor of economics in a university. You can't do this. So I wrote to him and I'm like, what are you doing, man? What? And he didn't write me back. And he took the piece down with zero explanation. And I was like, so then I wrote this whole piece about it. I'm like, this guy, he didn't. And now when you go to Google and you say, who are the chief critics of the printing press in the 17th century, his bullshit piece came up at the top of the Google results. So, I mean, this is months ago. And I was like, what is happening here? When like actual writers are willing to be this sloppy, I don't know what they think they're getting out of it. You know what I mean? So that's kind of where my views on the whole thing come from. It's like people who are ethical and actually care about, printing factual information are really going to need to step up and protect it, and protect the digital commons, and protect the future, and protect libraries, and protect archives, and protect verifiable sources of true information. It's become really urgent all of a sudden.
Well, on that, Maria, oh, by the way, for anyone watching, if you want to drop a question for a Q&A, please do so at the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Talking about technology, it reminds me of this app or website that somebody's developing with AI that for writers, basically you type in your premise, you type in your main characters, and it'll generate a sample scene in case you have writer's block. It's ridiculous, but it goes along with what the both of you are talking about in terms of the content, in terms of the bullshit that AI generates. And so comes my $10 question of, should art have an ethical imperative, right? And even criticism, should it have an ethical imperative in light of what's going on?
Life should have an ethical imperative. The world should have ethical imperatives. Did you see what David Simon said about that? It was so funny. Somebody was interviewing David Simon. I can't remember where now, but they asked him like, oh, you know, you could have used this. You must be looking at this tool for writing and thinking like, wow, I could have used that. And he's like, what? And they said like, well, you know, like if I'm having trouble transitioning from scene 5 to scene 6, and then I could just ask the AI, like, tell me 10 different potential transitions. And he goes, I would rather put a gun in my mouth, in like typical David Simon fashion. So real writers don't do that. They're not interested in it. I haven't seen it. I haven't seen anybody say that they would use it. I haven't, you know, for their actual writing. No, they want to play with it. And, you know, I mean, back to what Jane was saying, I personally have been like absolutely happy carving that thing up into tiny pieces. But like, you know, I'm very, very, very critical. And I think it's important to come out and speak out against it if you care about, like, you know, literature. But it's an opportunity. There's a danger and there's an opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really have, you know, I'm not, I think there's probably something different between, I mean, I don't know if art has necessarily, you know, an ethical imperative. I mean, maybe the question is for like, do writers, do critics, right, have an ethical imperative? Do artists themselves have an ethical imperative? I think I would, you know, I would say, you know, I'd say yes there, but I think it is really hard when it's sort of the whole point of the AI generated script is that there's no author. So you know, or there is, right? It's the algorithm maker or whatever. So I'm sort of, I think it gets fraught when authorship kind of gets detached from, or you know, like the writerly, the critical agent. You know, I will say that I did not realize this until I got dinner with a friend the other day who works in like the biz in LA, I guess. Like she writes in writers' rooms. She works in writers' rooms. And I, you know, you know, to speak on behalf of Maria's concerns, like it's a real threat for them. And, you know, something that she was sort of saying to me was what you are able, I had no idea. I mean, I haven't seen it, but I believe her, just that what ChatGPT is able to do and what the sort of script generating technology is able to do that we see of is actually like a sliver of, like they're actually more sophisticated than the public because it would be like too scary, I guess. So she's seen it sort of generate scenes, and you can give it notes anyway. So all to say that like there's something about like the lag of, you know, our anxieties. I feel like COVID was like a good example of this too. It's like you don't really know where the tipping point is when it's kind of over. But like she's thinking about like changing careers after that. So I was sort of like, this is you're panicking, but I don't know. So
Yeah, I don't buy it. I mean, I don't know. I would think we would have seen it. Like, you know, somebody would leak such a thing if it were true. I mean, the other thing is a lot of writers are really hacky. Professional writers, a lot of them don't write compelling stuff for readers. They're phoning it in. They're getting paid. You know, they have to like write something to write it, you know. And I mean, I think everybody here, like some of your stuff is better than others and succeeds more than others. It's like, if you have to ask yourself, like, what is this for? You know, the reason that I kind of find it difficult to buy that an LLM can write compelling work is that it doesn't actually even put stuff together out of existing materials. It just is a probability engine. It only really can guess what the next word is. It can't string thoughts together. It strings probabilities of language structures together. And that's where that stiltedness comes in. Like it doesn't, because it doesn't have concepts. It doesn't have a desire to unify thoughts into utterances that are coherent. That's not the point, you know. It just sort of predicts based on trillions of of sentences that it's seen, it predicts the likely next one that would satisfy the parameters of your inquiry. So I think that, you know, we can't expect every movie to be like, I don't know, Z. There was that list in the New Republic, did you see, of the best political movies? And it was really fun watching everybody yell when they didn't put their one in that they wanted. It's like, oh, movies are political. You know, it's like, it was really fun. But you don't expect every movie to be that good, but you do expect those values to be articulated and held in common in throughout a culture, right? Like, this is why I kind of don't believe in sort of the gatekeeper notion that we grew up with, the sort of whole Alan Bloom thing or Harold Bloom thing, either one. You know, the whole sort of gatekeeper notion of like, I am the adept who is going to explain from on high how you should think this, what you should think this thing means. Like, I mean, I'm so thrilled to be living in a time where that is no longer, it's just completely outmoded, right? Because everybody has something interesting to tell us. Like, you know, I will reject a lot of it, but a lot of times, you know, when you talk to a younger person and they tell you why they're excited about a piece of music or a film or whatever, and it's like, wow, it's so stimulating, exciting, and it like expands your own ideas so much. Like, maybe not necessarily the most sophisticated way, but in a way that's vivid and immediate. And like, if you value all that as the sort of larger purpose or function of text or whatever, then that's just a very different approach to how you're going to do interpretation, how you're going to do criticism, how you're going to read everything.
Well said. Right now, we're going to open it up to Q&A. Thank you, Maria and Jane. And if you have a question that you want to ask our panelists, please drop it in the Q&A button at the bottom. We have a question for you both. It says, how can criticism help us engage with plurality? That various communities, nations, subcultures are having conversations or making meaning in ways that differ from public conversations as we have them in the US and its institutions. Thinking of people of color, but also other countries, including the global South.
Oh, this is why I did Popula completely. Like, I was asked to, like, you know, I was given some money by this thing called Civil that was like a blockchain-based publishing platform. I was really excited to work with, and it was really cool. So 2017, 2018, and they got creamed in the crypto winter of 2018, regulatory problems and everything else. But anyway, so they said, like, let's just start a publication. Here's some money, go do it. And so I thought, well, you know, this isn't a huge budget, but it's not nothing at all. It was like, you know, decent. Like, what can I add to the existing discourse, you know, to existing sort of news, publishing, cultural coverage that will be useful and excellent? And that was the first thing I thought, was the insularity of North American media is its worst problem. This idea that, like, you know, the US is the center of the world, or Anglophone, you know, sort of like developed Anglophone world is somehow all we think about. You know, and I think that's like terrible. So I started Popula specifically with a view to bringing voices in so that everybody would be on the same, you know, everybody who writes for Popula is just a person who is talking about, you know, their views of the world and their experiences on an equal footing. There's no exoticism, there's no parachuting, we don't hire anybody, there's very little expat writing, there's no, you know, we want to hear the story from the person that's living it. And I found, you know, over the few years that we've been doing this, it's like this fantastic read, right? It's like we're broker than a joker right now. I'm trying to raise more money for it. But the exciting thing about reading it is, if everybody is equally has the same access to the same microphone, it just completely shifts your concept of authority. And I think, like, the thing that I try to do, like, you know, in my own practices, like in my editing and, you know, how I sign stories and how I read them, is to make sure that readers get to experience that person's voice in its as unadulterated a state as possible. Trust the reader to understand that this person, like, maybe English isn't their first language or whatever. I'm much more interested in getting the voice across than I am in, like, having a uniform tone for the publication. Like, there's all kinds of ways that we can present writers' voices and honor their voices that, you know, don't involve kind of like flattening everything into that sort of neoliberal pablum. I think that's it's a big project for me.
Yeah. Jane, what about you? How can criticism help us engage with plurality?
Yeah, I mean, I think I loved the Popula project. And I remember Maria's would you call it, not a blog, magazine, website? Sorry.
We call it out global.
Yeah, very. But I had some friends also editing for it, and I loved those sort of little dispatches, right, from around the world. It's sort of like, this is what my day looks like. And there was, I mean, my first online pieces were also for the all. So I think that, it's like a little depressing, but I do think that a lot of this, the possibility for plurality, at least from a US based website or a North American Anglophone based website, requires like the sort of funding, the funding model, right? The material structure to, and the actual kind of like editorial infrastructure to make that possible, because it's so true. I mean, the question, I think, implicit in the question is that isn't really the driving, not really the path of least resistance in most mainstream sort of legacy American magazines. So I'm always sort of sad about the fact that the all is over, and I would not have the career that I do if it weren't for the all, just sort of like, even within sort of the North American context, like giving writers who had not ever written before, right, a shot, and letting them like write about David Foster Wallace's marginalia, or whatever dead author that like no one is reading about, sort of whatever sort of and this is also sort of back to the people of color question, right? Like, I teach ethnic studies, and a lot of the texts are like, have to be like recovered, like actively recuperated because it wasn't like ethnic writers weren't trying to write in the 40s and 30s, 40s, and 50s upon immigration. Maybe they needed to be translated, maybe they just couldn't get a publisher, right? So I think a lot of it has to, and I do try to like convey this to my students, a real sense that like art can't just happen, or it's happening and it's not, there are sort of certain thresholds that means that they cannot be made public, right? So
things are better.
Sorry?
Things are better than they were when I was growing up, right? Like, I mean, you wouldn't have been able to have like The Sellout, or did you guys read Yellowface? I haven't read it yet, but it's like everywhere here in Scotland. Like, and it tackles a lot of these questions, like who chooses the frame that you're going to see this picture in, and the wall that it's going to get hung on, like whatever work of art or whatever novel or film or whatever. The person who pays to have it made, the person who pays to present it to you, makes all these choices about how it's going to be sold and marketed, and what the book jacket looks like, and who's going to talk to that person, and what kind of access they're going to get. And so like that, and we have and Brick House, which is a cooperative that I helped found, we have Miriam Gerba writing this blog that's amazing. It's called Tasteful Rude. I think everybody should go look at it. And she's written a lot about that. She wrote that really amazing, it had a very rude title. It was that barbed wire novel of the barbed wire cover, Gene Cummins. Remember that? It was called American Dirt. And Miriam Gerba is this Latina writer who took that thing to absolute shreds. It's like, like it's called something like, bitch, you ain't Steinbeck, or something like that. And it was really funny. But she has written a lot about this exact issue. It's like the framing and the marketing and everything that goes with those things, and how it affects what we're allowed to read, and how we're allowed to read, and who we're allowed to read, and how we're allowed to see them.
Right. It's an awareness from, the art making to the production of it, and being able to open it up. Thank you both for that. I think we have about 5 minutes left. I'll ask maybe one or two questions given our time. Can you talk about how you select material to respond to? Do you know if you're going to review a text when you seek it out, or is it more of a matter of reaction? Maybe just as an add-on, in light of the MFA students, watching this, like many of us, for me being a recent alum, a recent grad, we're stuck in, we're doing criticism for our assignments where we're in the weeds, we're talking about craft, we're talking about points of view, narrative, all this. How do you translate that, right? Or how do you select material then that will translate to a more public audience?
I am asked to review stuff fairly frequently, and sometimes I want to do it, sometimes I don't. And I won't work on something that I know I'm not going to have something interesting to read. It's like, no, I wouldn't. This isn't something I'm interested in. I won't read it. Sometimes you get offered a lot of money and you're like, maybe, but like most of the time now, I write about the thing that I go pounding on my editor's doors. It's like, you're gonna have to let me write about this right now, or I'm gonna be so mad. Just like threats. No, that's yeah, no, the more passionate I am, like, it's kind of that, right? It's like passion versus money. It's like, I will write something I'm really passionate about for pretty much no money. Don't tell anyone, but I will write, even if I hate it and they pay me a cajillion dollars, I might.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's sort of that. Yeah, sort of how I mean, I don't know. I also, I think it's like a product of the fact that I started writing for the All for Free. I was like one of like the first cycle of whatever they were calling their summer interns a few years after they had launched.
Oh,
Um, yeah, I was just grateful to write. Like, I was grateful that,
sure.
I was just happy to be there. So I think I have a kind of perpetual student mentality. Like, if someone asks me to review something, I'll usually say yes. I'm kind of like game for, I mean, maybe that's also part of the question about plurality. I'm kind of like, I hadn't thought of this, but if you're going to pay me something to do it, like, why not? I usually, it's like a spiritual exercise. I get something out of it. But in terms of my own pitching, I don't know. I think it's really, I mean, I think, like, I just want to acknowledge it's really hard to be a freelance writer. It's really hard to be a freelance critic, like literary critic. I do think that, speaking of, like, getting down to brass tacks about money, like, the pieces that I get paid so much more for are always my reported pieces. And for me, like, those are, for me, less like, I guess, intellectually engaging. They might be more like ethically important too, but they're certainly more timely, they're more politicized, maybe more explicitly politicized, right? And they do pay more, but in some ways they're kind of easier to write because I don't think of my reporting like as an art form. Like, I think of it as like getting information and collating voices. So in terms of like trying to be a book critic, like, you're reading, at least I'm consuming a lot of like the first 30 pages of a galley. I don't often know if I'm going to be interested in something until I've read it. So I think a lot of it is sort of like, you have to sort of be somewhat ahead of the publishing timeline. So I'm constantly like looking at, I don't know why I'm blanking on the word, but whatever the portfolio is, for the catalog is, like, for the next 2 seasons or whatever. So I think, a lot of it, I feel like I'm often at the whims of, how to go back to the framework question, how things get presented to me, how they get marketed to me. And then I kind of have to, like, use my critical lens and like at least read some of the text and be like, how am I reacting to this? Do I want to keep reading? Do I have something to say about whatever is happening in this text?
Right.
But yeah, there's lots of steps anyway. All to say that it is yeah, it's like always a process for me.
Well, I think for the both of you, you have your ear to what's being written in the moment, right? And so you're always in conversation with that, but also have, in conversation with text from the past. And it sounds like it's a balance of timeliness and timelessness, right? Of what's timely, how do I talk to that? But also you make that connection to more of the timeless narratives, right? That we keep coming back to in criticism. And so really appreciate the way that the both of you do that in your work. We are coming up at time. Maria and Jane, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for
really
having us.
love this conversation. Hope we can still be email buds. But
Thanks so much, everybody.
yeah. And thank you for everyone, students and alumni and everyone tuning in. Appreciate your time. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.